Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Community Camera. This is Walter Smith speaking on behalf of the Learning Resources Center at Corning Community College. My guest today is the current visiting scholar at Corning College, and it's been a delight to have him with us these 3 days and to enjoy his anecdotes and his wit and wisdom and warmth and whimsy and all those wonderful W's. Welcome to the program, Heywood Hale Broun.
Thank you, and thank you for referring to me as a visiting scholar. I think of myself in this outfit as perhaps a sort of Ronald McDonald type, the visiting clown or the visiting entertainer, but visiting scholar sounds better.
Well, entertaining you were, and certainly enjoyable you were, but I would not say clown, though the patches there do suggest a little, well, it could be a kind of academic robe.
Yes, and I had every wish to wear academic robes. I wanted to be a professor when young, and what particularly inflamed me was the costumes that the French universities gave with ermine collars, and they were of coral silk, and you had sort of waffle velvet hats, and I thought it was my last chance at medieval dress.
We're getting back to that. You know, I don't know why, but most American colleges adopted the Oxford mortarboard and fairly plain-looking academic dress, as opposed to the other options, which were certainly, pardon me, fancier. But now they're getting back. I notice many colleges are using some of those.
Well, I think the colleges could use a little glamour.
Yeah, I do too.
College was, in my youth, and this shows how long ago it was, a romantic place. And somewhere along the way, not entirely from student discontent, possibly from the feeling that some colleges got too big and some colleges seemed to put themselves in the service of an unpopular government. The college, I would like to see it again have what you might call the Dick Powell image, in which impossibly handsome boys and girls walk hand in hand across a well-mowed campus to ivy-covered lib and that kind of thing.
I think so. We have not enough of that in life. I have a very fancy outfit I wear when I bear the mace and lead the academic procession across the campus. And we try for a few brief moments to capture some of that at our little college. You know, Corning, you've been here, of course, 3 days, and we speak of it as a little college, which it is on the relative scale today. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 students, but when your father, for example, was at Harvard before the First World War, sometime before I gather, there were only 500 students at Harvard.
Well, when I was an undergraduate at Swarthmore, there were 353 men and 353 women. And the college being referred to as the Quaker Matchbox, the assumption was there would then be 353 married couples shortly after graduation. It didn't work that way, but we were a small college, and I think it has now only grown to 1,200, but there are now, I think this is where some of the problem arises, there are colleges of 30 and 40,000. And as Louis Brandeis once said, you can't have democracy in a community of more than 5,000 people, because then you get away from the individual judgment of people by people who know them and into the area of manipulation and public relations. I'm inclined to think, and I hope no one watching this broadcast has now attended University or Indiana University or Michigan State, to name two very big ones. I believe that I don't think you can get a proper education in a place with more than 5,000 students. I think somehow it then becomes a question of listening to lectures and answering the questions on machine records examinations. And I think students resent it. However, I haven't figured out how to cut, as one might cut a pie, a university into many small and friendly units.
Well, of course, the English college system at Oxford and Cambridge, I guess, tries to do that, really.
It does try to do that, but I was in Cambridge last November, and I did note the newer colleges look just like Left Rack City on Long Island. When one goes to Oxford or Cambridge, the idea is that there are the dreaming spires of Oxford. You don't want to see a great big red brick building with a lot of picture windows looking across the quad at other picture windows, discouraging, therefore, playful behavior in both sets of rooms.
Yeah, I think that's part of the problem, though. I suppose if you go to Balliol or you go to Magdalen, you go to King's or one of those colleges where there's still a lot of life within that quadrangle, etc., you do have perhaps some of that older spirit capture. But it struck me when you were talking earlier about the lack of integration with some of the college activities, especially sports, that part of the problem may be sheer size. It strikes me that in the days when Harvard was 500 students, that necessarily a lot of those people would know each other, and the various teams would, as they crossed the yard, you would see these people every day. It was a fairly intimate group.
Of course, the thing that we don't say, and we must be fair to today, is that those 500 were all upper middle class wasps, that a very few Jews of the better sort, and a nice Catholic boy, I mean, you wouldn't know he was a Catholic, were admitted, and that it was a very snobby and very narrow campus as well. In my senior year at Swarthmore, we had not only the boredom of a commencement address, but also a baccalaureate sermon. And we thought we were a liberal college, and I remember the professor who delivered the baccalaureate sermon told us how he was supposed to pass on to us the torch of learning, the wisdom of the Greeks, the accumulated knowledge of the Renaissance, all that stuff. And he suddenly said, I find it hard to do all this because as I look out at the faces of the senior class, I see that there are no Negroes among you, which is what we used to call blacks. And it suddenly occurred to us, my God, that's true. We hadn't even thought of it. We thought that giving a little money to the Hampton Choir as they passed through your prep school, or saying something nice about George Washington Carver was it. Even we, not a Southern school, we had not come along far enough to know that we were unjust, and we were suddenly reminded of it by a professor.
Well,
in that way, I think we have come a long way.
Have you come across in your, what I know to be wide reading from talking to you for 3 days, E. Digby Baltzell's book on the Protestant establishment? Have you ever?
No, my reading has been wide, but somehow didn't get to that. It sounds like an interesting book.
Well, and it sounds, some of the ideas are very similar to some of the things you were just saying, that the club-like atmosphere, if you've been at a boarding school and you go to Harvard and you've seen the same people around you, you don't realize that what's out of sync with...
Well, what the snob excuse used to be, there was a marvelous old expression that someone was NQ, and NQ meant not quite our sort. Very nice people in their way, I'm sure, but you must understand, they wouldn't be comfortable here. And the idea that you were being kind to people by excluding them is what made it possible for people to be essentially genial and also desperately snobbish. It would be an unkindness to let these people into the college or the club or the establishment because they, not knowing our ways, well, if you let them in, they would learn your ways, and were your ways all that valuable? But I wish that somehow we could preserve the intimacy of old-time college education and at the same time share it out a little more widely. When I look back, I had in one semester a course that had 2 professors and 3 students. It was a seminar in language and thinking, and we had therefore a psychology professor and a professor of linguistics and 3 students. You could afford that then. It would now be a grotesquerie which would only be allowed if the 3 students were studying something dangerous that the government needed.
I had a course somewhat similar where there were 2 professors and a few more than 3 students, but it was a classics in translation course, and one was a Greek specialist and one a Latin, and they would hold dialogues really in front of the class, and it was wonderful because we didn't know some of the right things to ask at that point, and they, by their prodding of each other and having some absolutely delicious arguments where they would get red in the face, but still reasonably in a reasonably gentlemanly fashion, and it was great to be caught up in that. There's still, though, the minorities that have been often discriminated against. Even today, with the much more open society we have, the old Anglo-Saxon model of what the elite should be is still a model that seems to have some viability for the upward mobile who attempt to identify with some of the patterns of the old elite.
Well, if you take, the best of it, there was in that old model a sense of fairness, a sense that there are rules and we abide by the rules. If you could strip away from that the fact that this fairness was only to be extended to those who were within the circle. One did not, if one were English, and we were talking today, you remember, about the expression, it's not cricket, meaning that you are not playing the game correctly. But that didn't mean you didn't have to play the game correctly with natives, and you didn't have to play the game correctly with frogs, and that kind of thing. You played fair with those you knew. Now, if you separate that out, the sense of fair play, and now say, but no, this is everybody.
But you know, there's a famous Spanish, well, I don't know how famous, I like him, a Spanish author, Salvador de Madariaga, who insists that fair play is an English concept that's not perfectly translatable into French or Spanish.
Yes, I think that's true. The French believe in what they call logic, and they believe that by logic there cannot be any such thing as fair play. That's why they have 97 political parties.
And for the Spaniard, he said it was honor or passion that ruled.
Well, we do perceive things differently. I remember an old saying that pornographic, or even not necessarily pornographic, writing about sex was referred to by the French as art, by the Germans as Kultur, and by us as psychology. And each of these would indicate how it is done. But I don't know that fair play is totally, I see the point, and I once heard Dr. de Madariaga lecture, and what struck me was that he was an Englishman with a Spanish accent. He was very much, he had been in the British universities and that kind of thing. He had absorbed a great deal, and if I may quote something that I quoted this morning, since we are on the subject of national character, it was that old saying by a Hungarian critic that if you speak of national character, you get into trouble because it sounds as if you are being prejudicial or chauvinistic. But he said, take the saying, the line from Shakespeare, it was the nightingale and not the lark, and then say, es si rossignol e non la dolce, and then say, es ist der Nachtigall und nicht der Lerche, and say there is no such thing as national character.
The only foreign language I have much facility in is Spanish, but I find that when I'm in a Spanish-speaking country, aside from all of the other differences, using the language puts me in a whole different mental process, and you feel yourself changing roles in a subtle way.
Yes, I think that's partly because, as you know, being a Spanish speaker, the Romance languages are not accented. You can't do, the Assyrians came down like a wolf on the fold, their cohorts all gleaming in purple and gold. You have to do it in so that French verse is all musical, and Spanish and Italian, just the simple question, a che ora comincia il cinema, or at what time does the movie begin, becomes a war cry. It's almost impossible to converse in Italian without getting excited. And I think as an actor, I have never acted in French, and my French is not that good, but I envy them their language, because I mean, take a line like near the end of Cyrano where he's dying, and in the English translation it says, you see me here, gloved in marble, shod with lead. Well, you've got 15 consonants to follow and fall over. And when he is French, he says, me voici, beauté de marbre, bonté de plomb. Oh, I want to play it over there, and I want to play it in that language. And it was we'll finish with language and go on to many other things, but it was another Hungarian who said that French is the most beautiful of all languages, and the example he had used was, les passagers sont priés de ne pas faire usage de la toilette pendant le train est en arrêt, which is beautiful, but all of your sophisticated listeners know means please don't use the toilet while the train is in the station.
I noticed as you were giving some anecdotes and relating some quotes that you fell very easily into some of the accents and impressions of the voices. I'm sure that was helpful in your years as an actor, and I suspect you still have a feel for that part of your life.
Well, I think it's the other way around. It was the years as an actor that gave me a kind of man of 1,000 voices predilection. Yes, I like if I'm doing an illustration and the illustration is of an Englishman or a Bostonian or a Frenchman or whatever, to come as close to it as I can. I have been told by various nationals that it is a fairly laughable thing you are doing, monsieur, and no one thinks of it as truly French. But that's all right, I'm not speaking to a French group. My son used to say that he thought of all accents the most hideous was Scottish, which is a pity because I am on both sides Scottish. And he used to say to me when he was very little, speak some Scottish, and I would say, they've got a little soldier in a bottle down, and he would say, no, no, that's enough, I don't want to hear anymore.
You were born into a literary household. Was that a strong influence on your choice of career?
No, I don't think it was a strong influence on my choice of career. It's a strong influence on the kind of life I lived. My father was a newspaper columnist. My father was first a newspaper woman, and then a book critic, and she had been an art student. And I lived in a house where there were not only all the bookshelves were full, but there were toppling piles of books. We were surrounded by books. In my room, I had bookshelves, and by the time I was 5 or 6 years old, I was reading a book a day, just consuming them. Some of them were no more than ground-up wood chip books, you know, Dr. Fu Manchu or that kind of thing, but continually I just absorbed and absorbed books. And I cannot, to this day, walk past a bookstore. I have to go inside. I have to look. And my wife will say when I come back for the trip with 6 or 7 books, but you have a lot of books, and you can never have enough books. If I were rich, I would build some sort of giant set of stacks and just keep filling them and filling them. And it's true, I own a lot of books that I haven't read, but I always say comfortably, I'm going to get to that, and more often than not, I do. And so I lived in a world of books, and my images are usually bookish images, and as you say, I am rich with quotation, not always the most fashionable quotations. Speaking of fashionable quotation, I'm sure you know this, but it's one of the great crosses that Yale must bear, that over the doorway of the Graduate Tower is engraved in the stone in beautiful lettering, "He was born with a gift of laughter and a sense that the world is mad." The architect liked it and had it put up there. It was there for years, and finally somebody said to him, "That wonderful line, where does it come from?" And he said, "It is the first line of Raphael Sabatini's Scaramouche," which some may remember was a cheap old novel which was made into a bad movie. But they then let ivy grow over it. They found out that they couldn't scrape it out. It's a nice quotation, just comes from the wrong book. But yes, I always have consumed and consumed the printed word, and I think, if I am in a room full of books and if some dread disease strikes me, if I can still turn pages, I'm going to be all right.
The observation sometimes been made that in the 19th century, when people were moving west across the continent, and probably those people not doing an awful lot of reading, but they would read the same things. Everybody knew the Bible, and everybody read some Shakespeare, and maybe some Bunyan, and maybe one or two other things, and therefore they could quote or they could make allusions that other people would all understand, and we don't seem to be able to do that anymore.
Well, even in my boyhood, it had widened a good deal from Bunyan and the Bible, but still there were about 50 or 100 books that sort of everybody knew. And if I were late for a party and somebody says, "What happened?" I say, "I stopped to talk to Huckleberry Finn." They would know that this is the thing that Tom Sawyer said to the teacher to defy her. It means I have no excuse. But I couldn't say that. And I say, well, who? They may not even know who Huckleberry Finn is. Or you could always, in my youth, quote from Gilbert and Sullivan, and people would always know what you meant. And indeed, there were, as I say, that bunch of books from which we could quote to each other. And it was a kind of shorthand. You could say a whole lot in a quotation.
We don't seem to have that thing to bind us together now. The very deluge of books has become, to a degree, divisive. I've just been teaching a course recently, which I stepped into on short notice, on Western civilization, and I was talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey as one of the elements that bound those separate Greek states together, one of their shared literary bonds, and it was so important in giving them that sense of Hellenism. And we don't, the Bible did that for a while, Shakespeare did it. There's nothing that seems to have that kind of impact. And then it seemed to me that maybe in some way, instead of an epic like the Iliad and the Odyssey, that for the average citizen today, perhaps sporting events are a kind of instant substitute epic that they can talk about and relate to.
Yes, certain heroes are spoken of to describe virtues. He was a regular Joe DiMaggio, or he had the drive of a Bronco Nagurski, or whatever. I do remember, though, as a wonderful illustration of the shift of the generations, I had reference in a television piece to Harun al-Rashid, by which I meant, as you know, a king who disguises himself as a beggar in order to hear what people are thinking. And since Alfred Drake had been doing this in Kismet, I didn't think it was too obscure. Well, it turned out nobody at CBS, this was a script sent in from the field, had any idea what I was talking about. So they left it in, and at the end, Roger Mudd, who was the anchorman with kind of a deadpan, said, "For those of you who don't know, Harun al-Rashid was the 5th caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad," which told them nothing. And I got a phone call from an old lady later who said, "Heywood, what is this nonsense? Who doesn't know who Harun al-Rashid is?" I said, "Everybody younger than you and me."
They read the Arabian Nights.
And they don't. And so, yes, there is the shared and narrow group of books that you and I knew, and there's the much wider, so they have a wider experience, but there's not much that they can share. I would hate to be quoting from Last Exit from Brooklyn or something of that sort.
I guess I remember that famous caliph because I was given by mistake, when I was still in very tender years, an unexpurgated edition of the Arabian Nights. And the purple passages in that really enthralled me. It was my first adventure into even near pornography, and I remember it vividly.
Well, yes, they see that. Perhaps it wasn't by accident. Perhaps your father thought, it's time Walter began to learn. Here, son, you may enjoy these stories. I think the first time I read them, the purple passages were in some other language or something.
Yeah, that's what Gibbon does in The Decline of the Fall. If it gets too outrageous,
erotic,
puts it in Latin or Greek footnotes.
But you, as a classical scholar, have a good dirty laugh right then and read it aloud, chuckling as you do.
Well, I had a professor who used to do that in his lectures, go into Latin at those moments, and of course we laughed whether we got the point or not.
Well, I do think that the pleasures of books are perfect in the sense that you don't get too old to read. You get too old to do a lot of things. But I remember reading about a man who at 96 had set up a reading program. It was rather limited. He read always the same books, so that on every April 3rd he began the 6 novels of Jane Austen, and then on every May something he began the novels of somebody else. And somebody said, "But you know there are only 6 novels by Jane Austen, they're short." He said, "The very fact that I know them is what adds some shape to my life, and I'm very anxious to become 93 so that I can once again say, it is time for Persuasion," and it starts over again. And I thought maybe when I got very old I would pick out a shelf of books and say, now I'm just going to go round and round and round through this group. Indeed, it was C.S. Lewis, the old critic, who once suggested it's a discipline I couldn't possibly manage. that we each pick in youth 30 totally worthwhile books. And oh, none of the fluff that I like to read. And you read these books over and over again, and you study in yourself your varied, as you grow older, approach to these works, which ones you liked in the beginning, which ones you become impatient with, as perhaps when you were young. You thought that Renoir was the world's greatest painter because it was all that pink, moist, rounded, girlish flesh. And then after a few years pass, you realize that Renoir can't draw, and that Rembrandt, and so it goes. What one cares for at 90, I don't know. I haven't got there yet.
Where did you find the title for A Tumultuous Merriment?
The title for A Tumultuous Merriment, which is a terrible title because people can neither spell it nor say it, comes from Dr. Johnson's definition of sport in his original massive dictionary of the English language. The definition: sport, play, diversion, game, frolic, and tumultuous merriment. And I try to say in lectures and in the book that it is the tumultuous merriment and the frolic that is missing from sport. That we ought to have it back. And my other book, I might as well drag up my other book, which has an equally impossible title, is called A Studied Madness. I can't even remember it myself. And that comes from a quotation of Hazlitt: "Actors are the only honest hypocrites. Their life is a voluntary dream, a studied madness." It goes on, they are the train bearers of other men's fortunes, and so on. But I get carried away. I like to think that if I use the writing of some better writer than myself, some part of his luck will rub off on me, as superstitious South Sea Islanders believe that if you eat the heart of your enemy, you will become brave. I think if you take the words of the good writers, maybe it will help you in some way.
If you eat the heart of your enemy, he'll become less dangerous.
Yes, there is that too.
I guess I remarked on this the other night when I introduced you, but you have these wonderful quotes, and I lamented then, and I do lament continuously, that educators today seem to frown on any memorization or any acquisition of good lines by memory, and I think that's a terribly wrong-minded approach.
I think it is, but there is also, I may have said to you, the remark made to me by my economics professor in college, who said, "Heywood, the first 2 years are almost always wasted." I said, "Oh, why?" He said, "Yes, either you come beautifully prepared, as you did from Horace Mann. My God, you must know every date in the history of the world." But he said, in the course of being packed with facts, you lost your zest for learning, and you tend to coast wearily through those first 2 years. Or, he said, they come from places like the Ethical Culture School, where their zest for learning is beautiful to see. One reason is that they don't know anything. And therefore, of course, they must be packed with facts. And then it's only in the last 2 years that you begin to learn. Memorization it's boring in a way, and yet an actor, what does an actor do? He's continually committing lines to memory. And in the committing of lines to memory, some of them are so good that you find that long after the play is over, you are still bringing back these lines. And since some things have been said so perfectly by someone who wrote them, it's a good idea to memorize them and then use them later. One of my absolute favorite quotations, and once somebody wrote and said, you know, if you were to give one quotation, it's a kind of a negative one, but it was written by Jonathan Swift, who said, "Ambition often puts men upon doing the meanest offices. So climbing is performed in the same posture with creeping." Now, that doesn't describe a whole segment of society in very few words.
Yeah, in a very few words. Well, whatever rules you followed, you are, I think, a marvelously educated man, and we thank you for sharing that with us these 3 days. It's been a delightful experience. Hope you'll come back.
It's been very nice for me, too. Thank you.
Our guest has been Heywood Hale Broun, the visiting scholar at the college this week, and we thank all of you who could not be with us for looking in on Community Camera.